All right, let's start with a softball. How do you guys define doxing? Because I've learned that everyone has a different definition.
Sure. So one can simply define doxing as revealing the identity of someone who has not done so in a public or widely distributed way as of that point. Generally with the intention of harming them by inciting the masses or inciting authoritative institutions to then be able to have a larger attack surface to essentially crack down on that person in the variety of fuzzy social ways that people like to harm people these days.
What do you think about person as a public identifier, but doxers disclose their address or physical address or numbers like phone numbers?
Sure. So that's just essentially a further form of doxing. So that's essentially the same thing. You're just increasing their attack surface to the public and other malicious actors, making it easier for people to harm them.
Agreed.
It's that, but I would add a word, and that's allegedly, because when somebody is doxed, everybody seems to assume that they're in the wrong. So that's my position. It's somebody who is being doxed for allegedly doing something harmful.
Do you guys draw a line between doxing and whistleblowing?
Oh, yeah, big time, of course. You can whistleblow and not dox.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I think whistleblowing is actually a fundamentally different thing. It's less revealing the personal information of an individual to create a larger attack surface and more revealing private acts that generally corporations or other like government entities or institutions are doing that would otherwise maintain a privileged silence. So your whistleblowing is actually generally increasing the attack surface of that institution to mass or other institutional pressure.
Yeah, I look at whistleblowers and see who's been punished versus rewarded. And I think the strongest evidence that a whistleblower is doing something that's valuable to society is whether they're being punished. I learned recently that some whistleblowers actually get a cut from the SEC fine that's imposed on a company like Facebook. I didn't realize this. It sort of makes sense, but it could be a lot of money. So there are some perverse incentives there.
Same thing. I mean, whistleblowing is pretty easy to define, right? It's somebody who whistleblows on something that's been done that's harmful or bad or evil, and they want the authorities and they want society to know. Doxing is simply what you do with that information, and then you go and dox the bad people on the internet. It's really just disclosing who somebody is on the internet because you think it's the right thing to do, because you think they've done some harm. For me, I don't think it's okay to do it any of the time because of the serious risk to getting it wrong. Like the false positive is so harmful to people who are actually innocent victims that it's so harmful that it doesn't make up for whatever benefit people think they get in disclosing the personal information of somebody on the internet. It's not going to change the outcome other than probably just them receiving bodily harm. It's a short-term solution for one person.
So it's a good segue into my next question. I mean, a lot of people dox because they're vigilantes, and they don't trust law enforcement. What do we tell these people who believe there's someone who's a legitimate harm to their community or to the world at large, who think that it's the only way that justice can be served?
Sure. So I think that that's a very valid perspective because currently we live in we live under a government regime that's already lost all moral legitimacy to the majority of people, and you can point to any number of factors, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or the vast proliferation of just corruption that you can point to at any level of the government and at any party or side of the government, or actually most mainstream institutions, which are in many ways synonymous with the government in some forms or fashions. So more or less, what I would say is that vigilante justice is not going to go away, regardless of whether it's moral, and that really what we should be considering is that our society is actually in a very, very fragile place where the main institutions that run the society have lost all moral legitimacy and have began to engage in anarcho-tyranny, where essentially laws are only enforced when they want to, and otherwise they just allow tyranny to engage and kind of harm all of their citizens to prevent any outcry. And so I would argue essentially that vigilante justice will increase, and that tribalism will increase, and that really we're talking about the ethics of wartime, of a spiritual war being basically occurring via digital means, because there's no more moral legitimacy to the government or institutions or the liberal democracies that have run our world order for the past few hundred years. And so given that total power vacuum, essentially we're going to see more and more doxing, more and more forms of warfare, of different tribes against each other, of different entire value systems against each other, who are all believing that they're engaging in a holy war against people who do not act within their value system.
Yeah, I think we've fallen into the sort of situation you describe where people are identifying others as friend or enemy, and there's nothing in between. I'm not a consequentialist, though. I do not believe that the end justifies the means, so I don't believe evil means are justified by good ends. And I think there are enough people who believe that, even among the cypherpunks and people who are heirs of the cypherpunks who want to build a better world that's digital, that has this sort of immaterial aspect you mentioned, that we can try to rebuild a better society on top of the wreckage of the old. Because I agree with you, the Western institutions are failing. They've lost trust and they've been captured by oligarchs.
I also think it's possible to prevent doxing, because it only happens in forums where there's huge crowds, like whether it's Twitter or Facebook or another platform. You don't seem to see it on LinkedIn too much. I mean, why is that? Is that because they don't want to attribute their assertions and their vigilantism with their business persona? Is it going to upset their business life in some way? And if so, why? Like, if they stop and think, why would that damage my reputation or the reputation of my business if it's the right thing to do? So I think there's a responsibility for new platform creators. When I was at AOL back in the 1990s, Brendan was doing even more incredible things back then. I mean, I was just part of a company. He was inventing stuff back then. But I was part of a team that helped to launch things like AOL Instant Messenger. And back then, we had great family safety controls. We had anti-harassment. And it wasn't, you know, it was a terms of service. And if you did harm, it was a proportionate response, right? You were warned, and then eventually you were banned. You know, you don't go into a restaurant and allow somebody to storm in and scream at people just because they have the freedom to do so. Just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should or that it's the right thing to do. And so there's a balance to be had, you know, between, you know, with these big platforms, and in particular for new companies that are being built now. They need to keep these things in mind and not be afraid to actually put in a terms of service. Give freedom of speech, but there shouldn't be harm brought onto other people. And so I think there's a way to actually protect people and just prevent people from doxing on those platforms in the future.
There's a definitional problem, though, because harm is defined differently by different people. And we've seen Twitter, for instance, take down accounts over what I would say is not harmful speech that is using public data, for instance, and doing, you know, correlation studies on it. And those accounts have been removed.
You know what I think that is, though? I don't think Facebook and Twitter and other big platforms are intentionally biased towards left or right. I think they're just really poor at content filtering. I think they're really poor at identifying what needs to be filtered and how to filter it, but the latter being the most important. They just don't know how to do it. Now, is it because they lack the desire to learn or to work with the experts? That's a different debate. But it's definitely possible, and absolutely right. I'm in agreement. The amount of stuff that's being removed that shouldn't be removed, and the amount of stuff that shouldn't be removed but is, you know, it's just crazy. But I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just lack of expertise.
I think that there are clear
I'm being nice, maybe,
biases.
Brendan, am I?
I think that there are very, very clear and consistent biases that these institutions have, and I think that you can see that in the political donations that their employees make, which are 99% in a single direction. And I think that you can also, I think it's very, very difficult to state that there are not biases or that there wouldn't be biases unless one essentially is just happy with the friend-enemy distinctions that they're making. So more or less, I would argue that the direction that society needs to move in is towards, well, I mean, frankly, all technologists and all technology is weaponry. All speech is weaponry. That's why it's enshrined by the Constitution, whether or not the Constitution has any legitimacy. But regardless, all technologists should understand their role as being equivalent to engineers at Lockheed Martin making missiles. And it's very, very clear from looking at the way that the military thinks of warfare and what they refer to as fifth-generational warfare, that psychological warfare is the key way that information is thought of in the modern day as moving through society. And so every technologist should be considering their own role in mediating and creating tools for others to both be able to just engage peacefully with their peers and their communities, which is, to be clear, a defensive tool, and also essentially ways to, I suppose, create offensive tools. And I would argue that Bitcoin was originally meant both as an offensive and defensive tool. In particular, I work on Urbit, which as a decentralized personal server operating system that allows communities to be able to fully own their tooling and communicate with each other in entirely self-sovereign ways and engage in communities that are basically creating social experiences like Twitter or engaging in productive enterprises, like what people in many NFT communities do on Discord today, that Urbit is, in essence, a defensive tool that allows people to reduce their surface area to others, reduce the amount they have to engage in public arenas in order to get useful work done and to make useful connections. So I would essentially argue that the answer is actually to make more and more varied tools that put more and more power into the hands of individuals and small collectives.
Huzzah. I totally agree. By the way, a lot of people got upset about Musk trying to buy Twitter, and some astute observers think, Thiel and Musk are developing sort of a kairetsu or a wing of the deep state that has a bunch of companies that are essentially dual-use technologies, because it's very hard to separate offensive and defensive uses. Almost all technology has dual use. So that could be true of Thiel and Musk. I'm not judging, but the fact is that system already existed, and it was Twitter from the get-go. It was arguably Facebook. And psychological warfare is the mode of warfare in our day. It's kind of good. We don't have people in red coats and blue coats blasting each other. It seems it's less violent, but it's ongoing, and I'd say it's rampant right now.
I have to take stock with some of the things that are being said, but I'll preface it by at least giving some foundational knowledge about me so that my assertion is not just seen out of context. I've contributed to a number of W3C standards, and I'm one of the original founders of the Mobile Web Initiative. And I've contributed to other open source projects like the Mozilla project. So I've contributed to the open movement, the open web, open standards. I'm absolutely all for that. But I also think we need to have a little bit more common sense, right? I mean, in the perfect world, everything would be democratized, everything would be decentralized. I run a security company called MetaCert, which is in the business of content labeling, content filtering, URL classification, something I've been studying and doing for 20 years. And it's about trying to, the big companies don't intentionally filter things. I mean, you can't possibly think that hundreds or thousands of engineers and designers and user experience personnel have all been told, we want you to write these algorithms so it's favorable towards these people during these particular points in time. And then, by the way, in secrecy, we also want you to do this. That just can't possibly even happen. There's obviously bias, right, based on the individuals. But collectively, I mean, there's probably one company for me personally, actually, that stands out as the elephant in the room. They probably do all the bad things that probably you could possibly imagine. But we do have exceptions to the rule.
Which one?
I don't want to be put into the same bucket. Mark, my co-founder in the audience here, he's a libertarian, but he's painted 2 US presidents. Now, he doesn't subscribe to their beliefs, but so what's his standing, and how does that get built into the platform?
How are you so sure that big tech doesn't have an agenda? You're very confident about that, and
okay, actually, so at the very, very top, I absolutely believe there is a big agenda, 100%. I mean, absolutely there is, and even in government and the top tech, I do. But I honestly don't think, given I have knowledge on how to actually manipulate and filter content. You just couldn't do it technically, get
so you
thousands
think
of
it
people
can't
to do
scale?
it. Sorry?
Oh, well, Brendan, it feels like you have something you want to say.
Unless it's one company in a specific country, right?
Well, Twitter's big, and I know one example. It's not too partisan. There were radical left groups who were critical of the prior president, and as soon as the current president in the U.S. was inaugurated, a bunch of them got deplatformed, like right then, 21st of January, 2021. And they weren't happy about it, and they were sincere, committed, radical leftists. Now, why were they deplatformed? I think it's because they were likely to take shots at the new guy from their point of view. And so I think there is a sort of control system here articulated through trust and safety, and I've seen how they act. And they definitely have biases, but it's not individual. There's a group bias, there's a policy, and it's
Tell me on a day-to-day, you build browser software, right? I've built browser software and search-related stuff and data sets. How can you do that? Like, how technically could a group of engineers decide to do that intentionally? I'm not talking about white people building software that's biased for white people.
Suspending accounts is easy. If you see accounts that you know are advancing a certain point of view, and you think they're going to go against the new president, and you want to prevent that, you can just take them out, and they do.
And it's also very easy to write vague terms of services that allow you to essentially exercise unilateral control over who gets to exert speech, which is extremely easy, and this is common practice. So essentially, one can look at Noam Chomsky's point here regarding the unity of the media apparatus and the state, and of course this also applies to every other large institution, big tech included. But so there's a Noam Chomsky interview where he's talking to a reporter of a very large mainstream news broadcast. And the reporter asks him, he says, so you believe that I am very, very biased and saying things that are untrue about the world that are coming from a very particular ideological standpoint? And Chomsky says, yes, I do. And he says, so do you think I'm lying? Do you think I'm purposely lying? And Chomsky says, no, I don't think you're lying. I think that you genuinely believe it. But I also think that you would have never been able to be in the position to be interviewing me or serving this public figurehead role unless you had that exact belief set.
So a comment to circle back a little more specifically to doxing. We have like pretty robust anti-masking laws in the United States, and it's believe it or not, right? But it seems like these things, and also the terms of service, like you should be booted off Twitter, for example, if you post personally identifying information, and they're very generous with what that means, but it still happens. So it feels like terms of service changes and legal changes are not helping this issue. So I mean, what can we do? Just all of us get on Urbit and
I'll tell you one
suits?
thing. I'll tell you one of many things that could help. If you take, for example, crypto exchanges and wallets, almost all of them require you to KYC before you even use the app, let alone make a transaction when it's required. And even then, it might not always be required. And so all of these companies have got in their databases everybody's personal information. So when that is compromised, and it's a case of when and not if, when it is compromised somewhere, then that information is then exposed on the internet. So if we could reduce the amount of times that we actually expose the potential of somebody's details being exposed by people or discovered on the internet, that would actually be one of many things that would be required. But I wanted to say that because in the context of the crypto world, I'd really like crypto companies to be really more mindful of the information they ask for and ask for the least amount of information possible. There's a company called Integral that's launching a new DEX and wallet codex, and they're not asking for any personal information at all. And then when you do use Apple Pay eventually to buy crypto, there's no need to KYC them because Apple has already done that. So don't do that for the sake of taking their information. So that would be one thing that could be constructively helpful in reducing the risk of people being doxxed.
So that's the DWeb or Web3 future. It's a DEX and a self-custody wallet, and that's great. though I do think Apple identifying you is material.
Okay, fair.
The KYC isn't
Fair.
just for the sake of rating your privacy. It's for anti-money laundering and for sanction enforcement in the U.S. So that's the Treasury's FinCEN department and the Office of Foreign Asset Controls. And they're using KYC as a means to an end. And whether you like the end or not, they have the sovereign power. They're pointing guns at you to enforce their will.
Yeah.
So when people talk about KYC and the risk of leaks, you're absolutely right. And I do like the self-custody and self-sovereignty of pure peer-to-peer crypto, but now they're making moves on that. If a centralized exchange, which is the only way to efficiently do fiat to crypto, for instance, now has to KYC an unknown address before you send to it. They're starting to reach their tentacles across this peer-to-peer boundary.
Yes, so I think the key here is, frankly, to build better defensive technology, to essentially allow more people to be in the position of having First Amendment protections over the code that they're writing because they're never running the code. They're never doing anything other than publishing the code. This is something that I particularly like about Urbit. Got to show my thing, obviously. But this is something that I think is unique about Urbit insofar as it gives you a single standardized virtual machine that you can run code on, that anyone can run code on their own personal server, that is extremely easy to publish typed functional code that does peer-to-peer communication directly over the wire to. So those primitives actually allow you to build extremely rich experiences of collaboration, of actual economy, that are extremely difficult to build in the browser context because you have to deal with more security concerns, because you have basically a much, much more complicated model of programming and interaction that involves a lot more glue. So if you actually unify the stack of tooling down to the OS level, not just the language and tooling level, but literally at the OS level, you have system-level affordances for storing private keys. You have system-level affordances for doing secure, encrypted, end-to-end communication with your peers. You have system-level affordances for literally maintaining side effects and writing out I/O. You get to a point where you have this extremely powerful stack that you can build social experiences, collaboration experiences with, et cetera, that's not limited in the way that the paradigm of the wallet browser extension is limited.
So I love clean slate systems. We need more of them. So hats off for doing what you're doing. I'm a victim of evolution for the last 27 years with JavaScript, and I've learned not to bet against evolution. So I see Web 3 evolving from Web 2. I don't see servers going away. I agree with Moxie and Marlin Spike. We should use better cryptographic protocols even with centralized servers or counterparties. And that means if there's a clean slate system that's going to wipe everything away, it's going to be over my horizon. But we could learn from it, and we can do things to simplify the web. The way you evolve the web isn't always just adding layers of cruft and keeping all the old attack surface. Sometimes you can build something new alongside the old, and then the old fades away. And that's been part of my work over umpteen years with JavaScript.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really, really into the notion that one can commodify and commoditize computation, and essentially not do so in the I think classic way that people on blockchains like to think of, as we have a computation system that's like AWS Lambda that you send off compute to and you pay for it, but rather literally make it extremely easy to run the equivalent of a Docker container that is extremely portable and movable, and basically literally make the service of a server a commodity that one doesn't have to think of or manage.
It also needs to be actually convenient to use.
Yes.
Discord is anything other than convenient for a tech geek using it for the first time, let alone mainstream. And so democratization, decentralization is absolutely important. But we need to also balance it with the user experience and know that, okay, it doesn't matter how decentralized it is or the lack of decentralization, in fact. Sometimes you might want the convenience. Just because something is open source doesn't mean it's safe. In fact, there's a lot of cybersecurity issues attributed to open source projects. And so open and transparency is one thing, but being able to actually understand and comprehend what you're being told is another thing.
So we have about 20 seconds left on the clock. So any closing thoughts? I want to shout out the Urbit meetup tonight, so in case anyone
I think he's pitched his Urbit enough times.
URBIT.
Orbit.
Yeah, and there's a meetup tonight, and hope to see you all there. I mean, any last?
Well, yeah, at some point, if anybody actually wants to grab us to talk or me with the red shoes about whether you should be anonymous or not, that's like the second half of it, right? Because there's probably people that want to talk about privacy and whether or not we should show our real identities versus our personas.
I think they're going to start kicking us off, so let's listen out.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.